October 8th, 1918, 0610 hours. The pre-dawn air in the Argonne forest, France, is cold enough to see your breath. It carries the smell of damp earth, rotting leaves, and the faint metallic scent of distant death. A thick, ghostly mist clings to the ground, muffling the sound of a million men preparing for battle. In a waterlogged trench near Hill 223, a tall, lanky corporal from the Tennessee mountains hunches down, his rifle beside him. He isn't checking his ammunition or sharpening his bayonet. His eyes are closed, his lips move silently. While others curse the cold or whisper nervous jokes, Corporal Alvin York is praying. He isn't praying for victory. He isn't praying for glory. He is praying for his soul. The men of the German 245th Reserve Infantry Regiment, entrenched on the heights of with their networks of Mexican machine guns, have faced thousands of American soldiers over the past week. They have seen American bravery and American foolishness. They are weary, but their discipline is iron, and their positions are strong. What the German machine gunners in that nest could not possibly know was that this one quiet, praying man from the Tennessee mountains was about to walk through a storm of bullets, dismantle their entire defensive line, and accomplish something so unbelievable it would be dismissed as fantasy if it weren't documented fact. This is not just the story of one of the greatest acts of individual heroism in military history. It is the story of how an army's most reluctant soldier, a man who begged not to fight, became its most famous hero. It's the story of how German officers, veterans of 100 battles, came face to face with a force of nature they couldn't comprehend, and how their laughter and confidence turned to stunned disbelief as they discovered what one man, armed with a rifle and a deep sense of conviction, could do against impossible odds. To understand what happened on that foggy morning in the Argonne, you must first understand the man himself. Alvin York was not born a soldier. He was born in a 2-room log cabin in Pall Mall, Tennessee, in 1887. But the dispatch of heart was likely distressed. The world he grew up in was a world away from the capitals of Europe. It was a rugged, isolated existence in the Cumberland Mountains, a life governed by the seasons, the harvest, and the hard truths of the frontier. From a young age, York's life was defined by two things: his incredible skill with a firearm and his deep, often troubled spirit. The York family was poor. Survival depended on hunting. Alvin became the family's primary provider, spending his days in the woods, hunting raccoon, turkey, and deer to put food on the table. He was not just a good shot, he was a prodigy. Neighbors and family would later recount stories that sounded like tall tales. They spoke of a man who could shoot the head off a turkey at 100 yards, a man who rarely, if ever, missed. He learned to conserve ammunition by instinct, making every single shot count. It was a skill born of poverty, a skill that the German army would later learn to fear. But this prodigious talent was paired with a wild streak. As a young man, Alvin York was, in his own words, "I want to consider the work of a tough and fight a great cock under the canoes of a titled order hellraiser." He was a hard-drinking, hard-fighting blacksmith who loved gambling and brawling in the saloons that dotted the Tennessee-Kentucky border. His diary, written years later, is filled with regret for this period. He wrote, "I was a sinner. I was getting worse and worse. I was just drifting with the tide." That tide turned in 1914. A revival meeting swept through his valley, and a tragic bar fight that resulted in the death of his best friend shattered York's worldview. He found God. He joined a small fundamentalist church, the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a denomination that took the Bible literally. Their interpretation was absolute. "Thou shalt not kill." For Alvin York, this was not a suggestion. It was a divine command. He quit drinking, quit fighting, quit gambling. He became a church elder, a pillar of his small community, a man who had traded the saloon for the sermon. And then, in 1917, a world away from his quiet valley, the United States declared war on Germany. When the draft notice arrived, it threw Alvin York into a crisis of faith. How could he, a man who had sworn an oath to God never to kill, now be ordered by his country to do exactly that? His pastor and his mother encouraged him to apply for Conscientious Objector status, a formal declaration that his religious beliefs forbade him from participating in war. On his draft card, under the question, "Do you claim exemption from draft? Specify grounds?" End quote. York wrote in his simple, clear handwriting, "Yes, don't want to fight. The local draft board denied his claim. The Church of Christ in Christian Union was not one of the officially recognized pacifist denominations like the Quakers or Mennonites. In November 1917, Alvin York, the conscientious objector, was drafted into the United States Army and sent to Camp Gordon, Georgia. He was assigned to Company G, 328 Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division. The army that Alvin York joined was a nation waking its industrial and military might, but the war he was being sent to was a stagnant, soul-crushing meat grinder that had already consumed a generation of Europeans. By late 1918, the Western Front was a 400-mile scar across the face of Europe, a landscape of craters, barbed wire, and death. The German army, after 4 years of brutal warfare, was on the verge of collapse. Their spring offensive of 1918 had failed, and the Allied 100 Days Offensive was now pushing them back relentlessly. But the Germans were not yet beaten. They were retreating to their most formidable defensive network ever constructed, the Hindenburg Line. It was a multi-layered system of trenches, concrete pillboxes, deep bunkers, and interlocking machine gun nests, designed to inflict maximum casualties on any attacking force. To break this line and end the war, the American Expeditionary Forces, under General John J. Pershing, launched the largest and deadliest offensive in American history, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The mathematics of the Meuse-Argonne were staggering. Over 1.2 million American soldiers would participate. They were supported by thousands of artillery pieces that fired millions of shells. The battle would last for 47 days, and in that time, the United States would suffer 120,000 casualties, including over 26,000 killed in action. It remains the bloodiest battle America has ever fought. The American soldiers, the Go Boys, were green. Many, like York, had been civilians less than a year earlier. They were brave, aggressive, and well-supplied, but they were being thrown against a desperate, battle-hardened German army, fighting on terrain they had spent 4 years fortifying. The Argonne Forest itself was a nightmare, a dense, hilly maze of trees, ravines, and thick undergrowth that broke up formations and made communication nearly impossible. Every hill, every ridge was a fortress, crowned with German machine guns that could sweep the landscape with thousands of rounds per minute. Into this hell on earth, the 82nd Division, nicknamed the All-American Division because its ranks were filled with men from all 48 states, was thrown in late September 1918. Their objective was to advance north, cut the vital Sedan-Mézières Railroad, and sever the main supply artery for a massive portion of the German army. But inside this vast military machine, Private Alvin York was still fighting his own private war. He was a model soldier in every way except one: he still refused to kill. He debated the Bible for hours with his company commander, Captain E.C.B. Danforth, and his battalion commander, Major G. Edward Buxton, a devout Christian himself. They saw in York not a coward, but a man of profound conviction. Major Buxton, impressed by York's sincerity, engaged him in a long biblical debate, citing passages that justified fighting for a righteous cause. He then gave York a 10-day pass to go home and pray on his decision. York didn't go home. He went to a secluded spot in the woods near the camp, and for 2 days and 2 nights, he prayed and read the Bible. He later wrote of this moment, "I wanted to be a good Christian and a good man. I prayed to God for the light to be shown to me, and as I prayed, a great peace came into my soul." He returned to camp with a new sense of purpose. He had reconciled his faith with his duty. He believed that God had given him permission to fight, that this was a war for freedom and democracy, a just war. He told Major Buxton, "I'm going to fight. I'm going to give them the best I've got." In May 1918, he was promoted to corporal. In July, he and the 82nd Division landed in France, and on the morning of October 8th, he found himself deep in the Argonne Forest, facing a German defensive line that had already chewed up and spat out thousands of his fellow Americans. His unit, Company G, was part of a larger attack to seize Hill 223 and capture the Deckerville railroad line that ran behind it, a key German supply route. As the pre-attack artillery barrage lifted and the whistles blew, the men of Company G climbed out of their trenches and began their advance into the fog. Alvin York, the man who had begged not to fight, was about to walk into the heart of a German machine gun battalion, armed with his rifle, his mountain-honed skills, and a faith that had been tested by fire. The German soldiers waiting for him had no idea what was coming. The shrill blast of an officer's whistle cut through the morning mist. It was the signal. Along the American lines, thousands of men rose from their trenches and began the slow, arduous advance into the tangled hell of the Argonne forest. For Corporal Alvin York and the men of Company G, the objective was a German-held ridgeline designated Hill 223, a heavily fortified position that commanded the surrounding valley. The American battle plan was a product of brutal experience. A frontal assault against the German machine gun nests on the hill would be suicide. The planners of the 328th Infantry Regiment had devised a flanking maneuver. While the main force of the 1st Battalion would fix the Germans' attention with a direct attack, a smaller platoon from the 2nd Battalion would slip through a wooded ravine to west, circle behind the hill, and cut the Decauville Railroad line, the primary artery for German supplies and reinforcements. This would, in theory, isolate German defenders on the hill, allowing them to be captured or destroyed. I think I can make a better fire. It's a good plan. On paper, I have seen one on my left. But in the Argonne forest, plans died quickly. The advance was chaotic from the first step. The fog was so thick that visibility was reduced to less than 50 yards. Men became separated from their units. Officers struggled to maintain command, and the terrain itself was an enemy. They stumbled through shell craters, became entangled in thorny undergrowth, and navigated a landscape devoid of landmarks. The constant unseen threat, the German artillery and sniper fire added to the tension. Leading the flanking platoon was Sergeant Bernard Early. Under his command were 3 corporals, including Alvin York, and 13 privates, a total of 17 men tasked with getting behind an entire German battalion. As they moved through the ravine, the sound of the main battle to their east grew louder, a continuous deafening roar of machine guns, rifles, and mortar explosions. It was the sound of their comrades paying the price in blood for their diversion. The men defending Hill 223 were not second-rate soldiers. They were elements of the 120th Württemberg Landwehr Regiment and specialized machine gunners of the 45th Reserve Division. They were veterans, dug into positions they had spent months perfecting. Their primary weapon was the Maschinengewehr 08, or MG-08, the infamous Maxim gun. To the American doughboys, the sound of the Maxim was the sound of death itself. A heavy, water-cooled, belt-fed machine gun. The MG-08 was a masterpiece of industrial killing. It could fire 500 rounds per minute, a rate of fire that could scythe through an infantry assault like a reaper through wheat. More importantly, the German machine gunners were masters of their craft. They had positioned their guns in interlocking fields of fire, creating what was known as a Maschinengewehr nest, a machine gun nest. From their elevated positions on the ridge, dozens of these guns were sighted on every likely avenue of approach. They had measured the ranges, cleared fields of fire, and prepared for exactly the kind of frontal assault the main American force was now attempting. The commander of the machine gun battalion, Leutnant Paul Vollmer, was confident. His men were well supplied with ammunition. They knew the terrain intimately, and they held the high ground. From his command post on the reverse slope of the ridge, he could hear the American attack beginning to his front. His gunners responded with disciplined murder. What seemed to me was only the slope of the forests in the city. They had no idea that 17 Americans were at that very moment slipping through the woods deep inside their defensive perimeter. Sergeant Early's flanking party moved with surprising speed. The fog and the noise of the main battle provided perfect cover. Using his backwoodsman's instincts, Alvin York helped navigate the patrol through the dense forest, moving from cover to cover until they found themselves where no American was supposed to be, behind the German front line. They emerged from the trees into a small, sunken valley, and there, in a clearing, they saw it, a group of around 25 German soldiers milling around a small hut that served as a major's command post. It was just after 0800 in the morning. The Germans, believing themselves to be miles from any danger, were eating breakfast and drawing their morning water rations. They were completely oblivious to the 17 Americans who now had a perfect line of fire into their position. Sergeant Early gave the signal. The Americans opened fire. The surprise was absolute. The Germans, caught completely off guard, threw down their weapons and surrendered almost immediately. Within moments, Sergeant Early's small patrol had captured a German major and approximately 24 other soldiers. It was a stunning success. They had gotten behind the enemy, disrupted their command, and taken a large number of prisoners. But their success had just sprung a far deadlier trap. High on the ridge above them, no more than 100 yards away, the German machine gunners, in Leutnant Vollmer's main defensive line, heard the sudden eruption of rifle fire from behind them. They peered over the edge of their trench and were met with an unbelievable sight: a small squad of American soldiers holding their own officers and comrades at gunpoint. For Leutnant Vollmer, it was a moment of brutal calculation. The American squad was in a perfect position to roll up his entire line from the rear. They were a big boy who would labor him by firing a soldier. He had to eliminate them. He gave the order. Freya, from the ridge above, a storm of steel erupted. More than 30 heavy Maxim machine guns swiveled around and opened fire, not on a distant enemy, but directly down into the valley, into the group of American soldiers and their own captured German comrades. The effect was catastrophic. The air filled with the terrifying, overlapping roar of the Maxims. Bullets tore through the air, ripping through men, American and German alike. In the first few seconds of the ambush, the American squad was annihilated. Of the 17 men who had entered the valley, 9 were hit. Almost instantly, Sergeant Early fell, severely wounded. 2 other corporals were killed. The small American patrol, which had been victorious just moments before, was now pinned down, leaderless, and being systematically cut to pieces. No, I had to be here. I had no reason for myself. I had no love for myself. The surviving Americans dove for whatever cover they could find: a shallow ditch, the muddy bank of a stream. They were trapped. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exposed to a torrent of machine gun fire from a superior, elevated position. For the Americans in the valley, the situation was hopeless. The only rational actions were to surrender or to die. But in that moment of absolute chaos, with his sergeant and comrades lying wounded or dead around him, Corporal Alvin York, the quiet man from Tennessee, found himself the senior non-commissioned officer left standing. He was in charge, and he was not going to surrender. He was not going to die. He was going to fight. Chaos is a crucible. In the searing heat of combat, it melts away rank, training, and plans, leaving only the raw character of a man. For most, that character is fear. For Corporal Alvin York, it was an unshakable, almost divine calm. As the air above him sizzled with a dense web of machine gun fire, York's mind didn't register panic. It registered a problem to be solved. His comrades were wounded and dying. His position was exposed. To his left, Private Michael Cecina was still firing his Shoshar automatic rifle, a weapon notorious for jamming, providing what little covering fire he could. To his right, other survivors huddled behind whatever meager cover they could find, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief. They were pinned, waiting for the inevitable. But Alvin York was not waiting. He was calculating. He was a hunter, and the German machine gunners on the ridge were his prey. His first action was instinctual, born from 1,000 days spent stalking game in the Cumberland Mountains. He needed to get to a position where he wasn't the easiest target. Crawling on his belly, dragging his M1917 Enfield rifle, he moved a few yards to his left, settling into a slightly better position on the forward slope of a narrow trench line. It wasn't much, but it meant the German gunners would have to expose themselves slightly over the crest of the hill to get a clear shot at him. It was a tiny advantage, but in a firefight like this, tiny advantages were the difference between life and death. From his new position, he was roughly 80 to 100 yards from the main German machine gun line, a distance at which he had shot the heads off turkeys back home. The German machine gunners were operating with methodical efficiency. One man fed the ammunition belt, another aimed and fired in short, controlled bursts, while others passed ammunition. They felt secure, perched in their nests, pouring a devastating fire down on the trapped Americans. They never saw the first shot that came from Alvin York. York didn't fire wildly into the German line. That would be a waste of ammunition, a sin in the mountains of Tennessee. He did what he had always done. He picked a target. He took a breath. He squeezed the trigger. His first target was a German gunner who had leaned forward to get a better angle. The shot from York's Enfield was clean, precise. The German soldier slumped over his Maxim gun, killed instantly. A second German, the loader, popped his head up in confusion, trying to see what had happened. A second shot from York found its mark. The loader fell back into the trench. The other German gunners on the ridge paused for a fraction of a second, but the American attack to their front was still raging, so they dismissed it as a lucky shot from the woods. They resumed firing. York picked his next target. Another gun fell silent, and another. What was unfolding in that valley was not a soldier returning fire. It was a master craftsman at work. The American M1917 Enfield was a superb bolt-action rifle, accurate and reliable. In York's hands, it became an instrument of surgical destruction. He was using the shoot and scoot method, firing a few rounds from one position, then shifting slightly to another, making it impossible for the Germans to pinpoint his location. The Germans on the ridge were becoming unnerved. Their comrades were falling, one by one, each with a single fatal bullet wound. The fire was coming from somewhere in the valley below, but it was too accurate, too methodical. It wasn't the wild, suppressive fire of a trapped squad. It was the calm, deliberate work of a marksman. They scanned the valley, firing bursts into the mist, but they couldn't see him. Alvin York was in his element. He would later describe the scene with a chillingly simple analogy. "I was just doing what I'd done in the mountains all my life." He said, "It was like shooting wild turkeys. In a turkey shoot, you can't just go shooting at the flock. You have to get the gobblers first. You get the lead turkey. Any others get confused. They'll just stand there and stretch their necks out, looking for what happened. Then you can get another one." That is exactly what he did. Every time a German machine gunner exposed his head, York's rifle cracked, and another gobbler fell. He was systematically dismantling the German firing line, one bullet at a time. The very thing that made the German machine gun nests so deadly, their close proximity to each other for interlocking fire, now became their greatest weakness. As one gun crew was hit, the adjacent crews would expose themselves to see what was happening, providing York with his next target. From his command post, Leutnant Paul Vollmer watched in a mixture of fury and disbelief. He had given the order to annihilate a small, trapped American squad. Instead, his own elite gunners were being picked off with supernatural precision. His firing line, which had been a symphony of controlled destruction just minutes before, was starting to falter. The rhythm of the guns was becoming ragged, as crew after crew was neutralized. Vollmer could hear the reports from his NCOs. "Gunner number 4 is down. Number 6 is not responding. Where is this fire coming from?" The Germans were professionals. They were not easily panicked. Their initial assessment was that they were facing a hidden sniper, or perhaps a small group of them, but the sheer speed and accuracy of the fire were baffling. It seemed to come from a single rifle. The psychological effect was profound. The machine gun was the king of the battlefield, because it projected power and instilled terror through volume of fire. It was an industrial weapon. Now, it was being defeated by an almost primitive method. One man with one rifle, firing one shot at a time. The industrial was losing to the artisanal. Vollmer realized the danger. This invisible marksman was not just killing his men, he was eroding their control of the battle. He had to be eliminated. But firing wildly into the valley was useless. He needed to force the enemy out of cover. He made a decision that, under normal circumstances, would have been the correct tactical move. He would fix the enemy with suppressive fire and send a squad to assault his position directly with bayonets. He barked an order to a nearby sergeant. 6 German soldiers, bayonets fixed to their Mauser rifles, rose from the trench line to his left. Their objective was clear: charge down the slight slope, cross the 60 yards of open ground, and kill the American sniper, who was single-handedly destroying their position. As the 6 Germans scrambled over the top of their trench and began their desperate charge, they were silhouetted against the grey, misty sky. For Alvin York, it was the moment of greatest danger. He couldn't possibly reload his bolt-action rifle fast enough to stop 6 charging men. The Enfield held 6 rounds, but the time it took to work the bolt, re-aim, and fire would be too long. The Germans would be on him before he could get that off. But Corporal York had not come to France with just his rifle. Tucked in his belt was a Colt M1911 semi-automatic pistol, a weapon he had barely used in training, a weapon that was about to become a legend. Time slows down in a moment of mortal crisis. For the 6 German soldiers charging down the muddy slope, bayonets gleaming, their world had narrowed to a single objective: the lone American soldier who was the source of their battalion's destruction. They were less than 60 yards away, a distance they could cover in seconds. For Alvin York, those seconds stretched into an eternity, a space where a lifetime of training and instinct took over. He knew his M1917 Enfield, as accurate as it was, would be his death sentence. The bolt-action mechanism was too slow. Fire, eject, chamber, aim, fire. By the time he could get off a second, maybe a third shot, the rest of the squad would be on top of him, their bayonets ready. He needed a different tool. He dropped his rifle, and his hand went to his hip, closing around the cold, checkered grip of his Colt M1911 semi-automatic pistol. The M1911 was, and still is, a marvel of firearm engineering. .45 caliber powerhouse, designed for close-quarters combat. But in the hands of Alvin York, at that moment, it became something more. It became an extension of his will. He didn't have time to aim in the traditional sense. He would have to point and shoot. What happened next was not just an act of incredible bravery, but a display of tactical genius born from a hunter's logic. A panicked soldier would have shot the first man in the charging line, but Alvin York knew better. He knew that if he shot the man in front, the others behind him wouldn't even break stride. They would simply run over their fallen comrade. They wouldn't stop until the threat was eliminated or they were all dead. So York applied the same logic he used when hunting a covey of quail or a flock of turkeys. You never shoot the one in front. You take out the ones in the back, so the leaders don't know they're being thinned out until it's too late. As the 6 Germans charged, screaming, York brought his M1911 up. He ignored the leader. His eyes focused on the last man in the line, the one furthest away. The Colt barked, a deep, authoritative boom that was starkly different from the crack of his rifle. The .45 caliber slug hit the last German, and he crumpled to the ground. The others, their senses overwhelmed by the noise of battle and their own adrenaline, didn't notice. York shifted his aim. The 5th man. The pistol fired again. The 5th man fell. The 4th. A third shot. He went down. One by one, from back to front, Alvin York emptied his pistol into the charging German line. It was a masterclass in calm, controlled, close-quarters shooting. The men in front only realized something was terribly wrong when they heard the shots, and suddenly found themselves running alone. The German lieutenant leading the charge was the 3rd man to fall. He was less than halfway to York's position when a .45 round ended his charge permanently. By the time York had fired 6 shots, all 6 charging Germans were lying dead or dying in the mud. The entire assault had been stopped cold by one man and his pistol. High on the ridge, Leutnant Paul Vollmer watched this impossible event unfold through his field glasses. He had just witnessed his last-ditch effort, a desperate bayonet charge, utterly fail. His machine gunners had been systematically eliminated by a phantom marksman. His assault team had been wiped out by a pistolero. He had lost dozens of men in the span of a few minutes to what was now clearly the work of a single American soldier. The mathematics of the situation had changed. Vollmer was a professional officer, not a fanatic. He understood the concept of diminishing returns. Continuing to fire his remaining machine guns would only expose more of his men to this seemingly invincible American. Ordering another charge would be suicide. His position was no longer tenable, not because of an army, but because of an army of one. He was tactically defeated. Among the group of German prisoners still huddled in the valley was the major whose command post had been captured earlier. Seeing a lull in the fighting, and likely wanting to save his own life, the major suddenly yelled out to York in English. English? He asked. No, not English, York replied, keeping his pistol trained on the ridge. American? If you stop shooting, the major pleaded, I will make them surrender. York's response was audacious, a moment of pure frontier confidence that would become legendary. He looked at the major, then glanced up at the ridge where dozens of German soldiers were still positioned, and said calmly, All right, tell them to do it. The German major turned and blew a sharp blast on his whistle. He shouted up to Leutnant Vollmer in German, relaying the terms. For Vollmer, the decision was agonizing but clear. To his right and left, his men were dead or wounded. Below him, a single American soldier had defeated every countermeasure he had thrown at him. To continue fighting was to senselessly sacrifice his remaining command. Vollmer stood up in his trench, a brave but foolish act that could have gotten him killed Instantly, he blew his own whistle, and then, all along the ridge, the surviving German soldiers began to stand up. They threw their hands above their heads and began to file out of their machine gun nests and down the slope into the valley. Alvin York stood up from his firing position, his pistol still ready, and watched in amazement. He had expected maybe a dozen or 24 men to surrender, but they just kept coming. Soldiers poured out of trenches, dugouts, and command posts he didn't even know existed. The small group of prisoners in the valley swelled into a large crowd. Leutnant Vollmer and 2 other officers came down and formally presented themselves to Corporal York, offering their surrender. York, with the help of the few remaining able-bodied Americans, Privates D'Alessandro, Konotsky, Suchina, and 2 others, rounded up the prisoners. When they finally did a head count, the number was incomprehensible. They had not captured a squad or a platoon. They had captured the remnants of a German machine gun battalion. In the end, Alvin York and his 7 surviving comrades had killed an estimated 28 German soldiers, silenced 35 machine guns, and captured Leutnant Vollmer, 2 junior officers, and 132 enlisted men. The man who had once written "Don't want to fight" on his draft card had single-handedly accomplished what an entire battalion had been tasked to do. But the battle was not yet over. A new, equally dangerous challenge now presented itself. Corporal Alvin York and his handful of men was still deep behind enemy lines, and now they were responsible for marching an army of 132 enemy prisoners back through the chaos of the Argonne forest to the American lines. The firefight was over, but the war was not. For Corporal Alvin York and the 7 surviving men of his patrol, the battlefield had transformed. The immediate, violent threat of machine gun bullets had been replaced by a new, simmering danger. They were a squad of 8 American soldiers, deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by 132 German prisoners. The slightest miscalculation, a moment of panic, or a single act of defiance from their captives could turn their miraculous victory into a massacre. The German prisoners, now disarmed, were dazed and demoralized, but they were still soldiers. They outnumbered the Americans by more than 16 to 1. York knew that his control over the situation was fragile, held together only by the sheer shock of what they had just witnessed and the authority of his M1911 pistol. He had to get them back to the American lines, a journey of several miles through an active war zone. This was not a task for a soldier, it was a task for a leader, and in that moment, Alvin York, the quiet corporal from Tennessee, became a general. He barked orders with a newfound authority. He lined the prisoners up in a long column, and then he made a decision of pure tactical brilliance. He walked up to the captured German major and Leutnant Vollmer. "You and your lieutenant," York stated, his voice calm but unyielding, "will march at the head of the column with me. I'll be right behind you. If any other Germans fire on us, or if any of your men try anything, I will shoot you first." It was a masterful psychological move. In one stroke, York had turned the enemy officers into his unwilling bodyguards. Their survival was now directly tied to his own. The German officers understood the calculus immediately. It was now in their own best interest to ensure the column returned safely, to prevent any further bloodshed from either side. The journey back was a surreal odyssey through the ravaged landscape of the Argonne. A small group of weary Americans, led by a Tennessee corporal, herding a massive column of German prisoners through the fog of war. York, with the German major at his side, led from the front. The other 6 Americans flanked the column, their rifles ready. They had not gone far before they stumbled upon another German machine gun nest, its crew unaware of what had happened on the ridge. The German gunners stared in disbelief at the approaching column, their own officers at the front, followed by an American corporal and a sea of German uniforms with their hands up. Before they could react, York turned to the German major. "Tell them to surrender, or I'll kill you right here," he ordered. The major, with York's pistol lightly pressed against his back, needed no further encouragement. He shouted to the machine gunners, ordering them to lay down their arms and join the column. Faced with a direct order from a senior officer and the bizarre sight before them, the stunned gunners complied. They emerged from their trench and were added to York's ever-growing collection of prisoners. This scene repeated itself multiple times. As they moved towards the American lines, they encountered other pockets of German resistance. Each time, York used his officer hostages to command a surrender. His column of 132 prisoners began to swell. He was no longer just a captor, he was a force of nature, rolling up the German line from the inside out. The return journey was perilous. At one point, an American artillery shell landed dangerously close, a reminder that they were still in no man's land. But through it all, York remained a picture of calm control, a shepherd guiding his unwilling flock through the valley of death. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, they saw the familiar silhouette of American Broy helmets. They had reached the command post of the 2nd Battalion, 328 Infantry. The American soldiers in the trenches stared, their mouths agape at the impossible sight emerging from the mist. A single American corporal and a handful of men marching a German army towards them. York's immediate superior, Lieutenant Woods, was one of the first to see him. Woods, who had likely written off the flanking party as lost, could only stammer, "Nephew." "York, have you got them all?" York's reply was simple, devoid of any bravado. "No, Lieutenant," he said. "I ain't got them all. I only got 132. The arrival of Alvin York and his prisoners sent shockwaves through the American command. Initially, no one could believe the story. It sounded like a wild exaggeration. When York reported to his brigade commander, Brigadier General Julian Lindsey, the general was famously skeptical. The story goes that Lindsey, after listening to the initial report, remarked dryly, "Well, York, I hear you've captured the whole damned German army." York, ever literal and humble, simply replied, "No, sir, I got only 132. An immediate investigation was launched. Military intelligence officers interrogated the captured German officers, including Leutnant Vollmer. Separately, they all told the same unbelievable story. They described being systematically picked off by a single, invisible marksman. They recounted the failed bayonet charge, stopped by one man with a pistol. They confirmed that one American corporal had been responsible for the complete collapse of their position and their subsequent surrender. The official count was verified: 35 machine guns neutralized, at least 28 Germans killed, and 132 captured. The evidence was irrefutable. The news spread like wildfire, first through the 82nd Division, then through the entire American Expeditionary Force, and finally, back home to the United States. Alvin York, the quiet, conscientious objector from Pall Mall, had become a national hero. The army immediately recognized his incredible feat. He was promoted to sergeant and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest honor for valor. But General John J. Tower Pershing, the commander of all American forces in Europe, personally reviewed the case and deemed the award insufficient. The Distinguished Service Cross was upgraded to the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration. The citation read, in part, "After his platoon had suffered heavy casualties and 3 other non-commissioned officers had become casualties, Corporal York assumed command. Fearlessly leading 7 men, he charged with great daring a machine gun nest which was pouring a deadly and incessant fire upon his platoon. In this heroic feat, the machine gun nest was taken, together with 4 officers and 128 men and several guns." The accolades didn't stop there. France awarded him the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor. Italy gave him the Croce al Merito de Guerre. He became one of the most decorated American soldiers of the war. When the war ended a month later, Sergeant Alvin York returned to America, not as a quiet corporal, but as a living legend. He was greeted with ticker-tape parades in New York City and a hero's welcome in Washington, D.C. He was offered hundreds of thousands of dollars for endorsements, movie deals, and stage appearances, a fortune for a poor boy from the mountains. He turned it all down. Alvin York's story is remarkable, not just for what he did on the battlefield, but for what he did after. He refused to capitalize on his fame. For him, the war had been a solemn duty, not an opportunity for profit. He returned to his small cabin in Pall Mall, married his sweetheart, Gracie Williams, and sought to live a quiet life. But he used his fame for one purpose: to help his people. He dedicated the rest of his life to bringing education to the isolated children of the Cumberland Mountains. He tirelessly fundraised to build a school, the Alvin C. York Institute, believing that education was the only way to a better life. He once said, "I'm as proud of the school as I am of my war record." The story of Sergeant Alvin York remains one of the most extraordinary in military history. It's a testament to the fact that wars are not just won by armies, but by individuals. It's the story of how a man's deeply held faith and his unique, mountain-honed skills converged at a single moment in time to produce a feat of arms that defies belief. The German troops who were stunned by that one American sergeant in the Argonne forest had witnessed something profound. They had seen that a man's character can be a more powerful weapon than a machine gun. They had learned that courage, conviction, and a lifetime of practice could overcome impossible odds. The quiet man from Tennessee who didn't want to fight had shown them and the world what it meant to be a hero. He did his duty, and then he went home, leaving behind a legend that will never be forgotten.